I'd like to welcome my very special guest, Richard Fisher. Finding a lot of new free time these days, I would guess. Correct, Richard?
Well, Rick, I hope to, and I certainly hope to get on a golf course every now and then, but we'll see.
All right, let's start at the beginning with something easy but super important. If you had to rate the U.S. economy 0 to 10, 10 being the best, 0 being, of course, the least vibrant, where would you peg the U.S. economy at this point in time?
Well, in relative terms, relative to the rest of the world, I'd say we're as close to that upper end of the scale, that is broaching 10. We're number one. And if you take the NAFTA countries as a whole, United States, Mexico, and Canada, this is the epicenter of world growth. That's why we have a strong dollar. It's why people are funneling money into the United States. We are a growth economy, as someone said earlier in the show. And we're moving forward. We've just had a huge tax cut in terms of oil prices. It may slow down employment growth here in Texas, but it's good for the rest of the nation. And we're in a sweet spot right now. The markets are high. Interest rates are low. The economy is still growing. Again, we've had a massive tax cut in terms
Richard,
of the cost of
I hate to interrupt
inputs.
somebody of your
We're in good
stature,
shape.
though, but here's one issue. Can you give me an answer without grading on a curve? Okay, so the markets are high. Okay, do you think any part of the stock market being high has anything to do with the committee that you just left in terms of being a part of? And if you didn't grade on a curve and you graded the U.S. economy based on history, maybe considering over 6 years of zero interest rate policy, would you still give it a 10?
Well, Rick, first of all, what the FOMC wanted to accomplish has been accomplished. You remember as well as I do, the market bottomed on March 9th of 2009. It's tripled since then. Cut interest rates to zero, started buying bonds, injected a lot of liquidity into the economy. What worries me, however, is how lazy investors have gotten, totally dependent on the Federal Reserve. I find this to be a precarious situation, but all I'm saying is right now, in terms of the real economy, we are growing. Others are not growing as well as we are. We're still inventing. We're still innovating. This is a remarkable place, the United States. Are we vulnerable, in my personal opinion, to a significant equity market correction? I do believe we are. And the reason for that is people have gotten lazy. They've depended totally on the Fed.
But Richard, if investors are getting lazy, listen, if I have a dog that's hungry and every time I give him a can of food, I ring a bell, we all know that we're going to condition that dog. Has not the Federal Reserve conditioned investors to be lazy? I mean, who do we point the finger at? You know, if you leave raw meat out and your dog eats it, do we blame the dog, or should human behavior be an issue that the committee takes under review a little more closely?
Well, look, I've sat through that committee for 10 years. It does take this under review. It had a job to do, which was to, of course, patch the economy together, save it. That was Ben Bernanke's job. Now, Janet Yellen's job is to engineer the exit and go back to normalization. What I find interesting, Rick, is here's this diminutive woman. The way she's being portrayed as Atlas holding the world on her shoulders. It's an awesome responsibility. But there will be normalization over time. We're now uber accommodative. And even if the base rate is raised sometime, June, September, whenever it is, it's still going to be very accommodative monetary policy. What worries me is the people that watch this show, and particularly the big money traders, are just completely dependent on the Fed. Look at the volatility we had the last few days, whether one word is interpreted one way or the other. So, yes, we have, as the FOMC has conditioned the markets. I think the markets, however, have a responsibility to do their own work and to expect that as the economy improves, things are going to change over time. The Yellen Committee will engineer normalization, however long that takes, and I think the market should get prepared for it. What I don't like is when market commentators come back and blame the Fed for their own problems, and that's what I worry about. I could see a correction taking place of substantial magnitude. Should the Fed react because that's happening? I don't believe so. I've argued that at the table when I was at the table, because, after all, this market is hyper overpriced, in my view, and these interest rates are abnormally low, engineered by the Fed to be sure, but that's because nobody else was doing anything on the fiscal policy side, and we had to act. So You know, who do you point the blame at? Your dog analogy is very interesting. Your dog analogy is very interesting, but
Richard,
the fact is,
here's my
they want us
issue.
to
You
keep
said
feeding
something
them
in there
this red meat, and I don't think that's the job of the FOMC.
I agree. Okay, so now you said something. It's about time investors quit getting lazy and the market needs to do its work. Many of us in Chicago and around the country now think the market's going to have a very difficult time trying to do any sort of work. Just think about the amount of tradable float in treasuries and all the issuance in corporates. Do you see this as an issue that's getting worse based on the ongoing over 6-year policies? Are we going to have a lot more flash crashes when normalization occurs because the markets aren't going to be able to handle the volatility?
You know, I don't know. One other statistic you should look at, there's over $2 trillion in emerging market bonds now. Most of them are commodity related. So we've had all these markets explode. There's massive liquidity. Yes, we are the central bank of the world. We've injected enormous liquidity into the system. We've floated all boats. But at the same time, what the FOMC is guided by is the real economy. The real economy is much better than it was. It continues to grow. It benefits from recent developments for the United States as a whole. And I just hope that people are beginning to discount in their own ways at some point that the base rate will be raised. Now, when that happens is subject to the judgment of the committee. But,
well, listen, Richard, I'm out of time. I could talk to you for another 6 minutes.
It's up to the Fed, and the Fed has to save the world, and Janet Yellen has to save the world. I think that's an undue burden, and I think it's an unfair burden.
Listen, one-word answer to finish up. Will Janet Yellen and the committee raise rates at all in 2015, in your opinion? Yes or no?
That's up to them. If I were in her shoes, which would be interesting, she wears heels, by the way, I would raise rates in 2015. It doesn't mean that it has to be raised at every single meeting, but I would start the process. I think we're moving in that direction. As to when, that's up to the committee, Rick.